When the clock strikes 0, life will end, and the reckoning will be complete. In the twilight hours of a condemned prisoner's final day, the weight of a lifetime's worth of choices comes crashing down. Can justice ever truly be served through execution? Before lying over lethal benches and sitting on electrocution chairs, we'll bear witness to the somber rituals that mark their final day. The selection of a last meal, a bittersweet last conversation, and the penning of final words. For many, these final moments offer a chance at redemption, a last opportunity to make peace with their past transgressions. Let's get into it. Donald Grant. Donald Grant whispered the tragic tale of a life so full of struggle and heartbreak, it's almost too much to bear. From the moment he drew his first breath, the cards were stacked against him. A few minutes before his last breath at the prison in McAllister, Donald spilled a very sorrowful speech. In his final phone calls, Donald's voice conveyed a mixture of resignation and defiance, as he spoke of the harsh lessons he had learned on the unforgiving streets. "Life is kill or be killed," he said, a stark reflection of the philosophy that had emerged from his experiences. And when it came time for his last meal, each bite of pizza, peach cobbler, and Pepsi was laced with the bittersweet flavor of finality, a final taste of a world he was about to leave. Born into a world that offered little in the way of hope or opportunity, Donald's early years were a constant battle for survival. As a child, he had to scrounge for food, scraping together whatever scraps he could find just to quiet the gnawing pangs of hunger. But even that paled in comparison to the turmoil he faced at home. When his mother succumbed to the grip of crack addiction in the 1980s, young Donald, just 9 or 10 years old, found himself thrust into a nightmare. The caregiver he once knew transformed into an abuser, raining down both physical and emotional torment upon him. The scars of those beatings would never truly heal, and it was against this backdrop of pain and desperation that Donald's path took a dark turn. In a desperate attempt to rescue his girlfriend from legal troubles while she was hitting at La Quinta Inn in Del City, Donald concocted a plan that would have devastating consequences. On that fateful day, he entered the hotel, confronted the manager, Brenda Melia, and shot her before delivering a final, fatal blow with a box cutter. Moments later, he encountered the hotel clerk, Suzette Smith, and mercilessly shot her in the face 3 times. The trial was a somber affair, as the jury was faced with the harrowing task of delivering a verdict on a crime that was both heinous and senseless. In the end, Donald was found guilty and sentenced to death. As the final hours of his life ticked away, the psychological torment of counting down to one's execution must have been a truly unimaginable burden. As his family members prepared to witness his execution, the emotional weight of saying goodbye, of expressing love and remorse, must have been a crushing weight to bear. And when Donald uttered his final words, "I'm good, don't worry, I'm solid," it was a desperate attempt to offer comfort, to assure them that he was at peace with his fate. But alas, the tragic tale of Donald Grant was not to have a happy ending. On the dawn of January 27, 2022, the walls of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary contained not just his physical form, but the culmination of a life's worth of regrets and fears. And as the execution began at 10 o'clock a.m., and he was declared unconscious and dead 16 minutes later. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy had been on death row for 14 long years. He'd tried everything to get his sentence overturned, but nothing worked. Known as the Killer Clown, he was finally going to pay for his crimes on May 10, 1994. The morning of May 9, 1994, began Gacy's final 24 hours. Early that morning, the 52-year-old was flown by helicopter from Menard Correctional Center in Illinois to Stateville Penitentiary near Chicago. You'd think he'd be nervous or scared, but no. Gacy was surprisingly chatty. He talked about everyday things like the Chicago Cubs, as if he wasn't about to die. His death row attorney, Karen Conti, even mentioned how cheerful he was. He didn't act like someone with only a few hours left to live. He just wanted to socialize with the people visiting him for the last time. That afternoon, Gacy was allowed to have a private picnic on the prison grounds. His family and some old neighbors came. Despite his horrific crimes, these people would miss him. For his last meal, Gacy asked for a bucket of KFC chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. As the time drew near, Gacy wanted to make peace with God. A Catholic priest came to give him his last rites before he was taken to the execution chamber. He was going to die by lethal injection. There are many stories about what happened in the execution chamber. Some say his last words were, "Kiss my ass." But in 2020, prosecutor William Kunkel said that Gacy had directed those words at a prison official, not as part of any official statement. Even in the end, Gacy believed he didn't deserve to be executed. He told his lawyer that his death wouldn't make up for the loss of his victims, and that the state was just murdering him. Outside the prison, the atmosphere was tense. Over 1,000 people had gathered. Most were cheering for the execution, wearing t-shirts with slogans like "No tears for the clown." But there were also some anti-death penalty protesters. At 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead by lethal injection. For years, he had fooled everyone, pretending to be a simple businessman who dressed up as a clown to entertain children. But underneath it all, he was a psychopath who raped, tortured, and killed young men. Gacy's troubled life began in childhood. His father was an alcoholic who abused his family. As an adult, Gacy seemed to have overcome his difficulties. He started a family and built a life. But in 1968, he was convicted of sexually assaulting teenage boys and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released after just 18 months for good behavior. After his release in 1970, it looked like Gacy had turned his life around. He met and married his second wife and started his own construction business, PDM Contractors. But unfortunately, his dark side remained hidden, leading to his eventual capture and conviction for the brutal murders that shocked the nation. Theodore Robert Bundy. On the morning of January 24, 1989, a somber silence fell over America. Theodore Robert Bundy, one of the country's most notorious serial killers, had finally drawn his last breath. In the final days of his life, the once self-proclaimed cold-hearted son of a bitch had begun to show cracks in his hardened exterior. Facing the reality that his appeals would not save him from the electric chair, Bundy began to open up about his crimes and the inner turmoil that had consumed him. "I deserve certainly the most extreme punishment," he acknowledged. "Society deserves to be protected from me and from others like me." During his last 24 hours, Bundy continued to interact with investigators and journalists, including FBI agent Bill Hagmaier, with whom he had developed an unlikely friendship over the years. Even as Bundy spoke of deserving punishment, Hagmaier revealed that the killer had contemplated taking his own life, unwilling to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die. Ultimately, Bundy chose to spend his final hours weeping and praying, surrounded by the Methodist minister Fred Lawrence. Outside the prison walls, a crowd of hundreds had gathered to celebrate Bundy's impending demise, drinking beer and chanting for the killer to be burned inside the prison walls. Born on November 24, 1946, Bundy had once been described as charming and intelligent, traits he used to mask his depraved tendencies and lure unsuspecting victims. Between 1974 and 1978, he embarked on a horrific killing spree, sexually assaulting and murdering dozens of young women and girls. Despite his crimes, Bundy maintained his innocence for years, only begrudgingly confessing when he believed the information could work to his advantage. Even in his final moments, as he was strapped into the electric chair, the once cold-hearted killer turned to his attorney and the minister, asking them to convey his love to his family and friends. As the clock struck 7:16 a.m., Bundy's life came to an end. His execution met with a chorus of celebratory fireworks outside the prison. It was a grim and unsettling end to a life marked by unfathomable darkness. Thomas Cree. As the final hours ticked by, Thomas Cree sat in his cell, the walls around him bearing silent witness to his somber reflections. At 73 years old, after over 40 years behind bars, the end was near for this long-serving death row inmate. With the legal battles raging on outside, Cree's team of attorneys fighting to the last to argue that his trial was flawed, his thoughts turned inward. He knew all eyes were on him, the prison staff, the protesters, the lawyers, and even the relatives of his victims. They were all waiting with bated breath for the Supreme Court's decision that would seal his fate. In these final hours, Cree took a bit of comfort in his last meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and ice cream. The spiritual advisors who had guided him through his time on death row also provided a measure of solace. But the weight of his actions, the lives he had taken, hung heavy on his mind. Cree was acutely aware that his execution, to be carried out by lethal injection, would be a somber end to a life marked by violence. He had admitted to killing 23-year-old David Jensen, a crime that had condemned him to this fate. Now, after over 4 decades, the legal tangles of his case were finally unraveling, leading inexorably to this final chapter. As the hours slipped away, Cree's reflections weren't just about himself. He knew the gravity of the moment, the lasting impact his death would have. In these last precious moments, Cree grappled with the enormity of it all, the weight of his actions, the pain he had caused, and the irreversible nature of the punishment that now awaited him. Scott Raymond Dozier. In 2005, Dozier was convicted of the murder of Jason Griffin Green and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. However, he was later extradited to Nevada, where he was tried and convicted for the murder of Jeremiah Miller. Then in October 2007, Dozier was sentenced to death for Miller's murder. In the early 2000s, Scott Dozier was involved in the production of methamphetamine, which is probably how he met his first victim, Jeremiah Miller. In 2002, Dozier and Miller set up a meeting at a motel on the Las Vegas Strip. The meeting was business-related, as Dozier had promised to help Miller purchase ephedrine, a major ingredient in meth production. Miller arrived with $12,000 in cash for the transaction, but didn't know Dozier had other plans. Not only did Dozier murder Miller, but he also used a saw to divide Miller's body into tiny pieces and stuffed them into a suitcase, which he disposed of near an apartment complex in Las Vegas. Dozier stole Miller's money and went on a spending spree while Miller's body decomposed in a suitcase. A few days later, a worker discovered the suitcase with parts of Miller inside, though his head and arms were missing. Dozier was arrested in connection to the murder in June of 2002 in Phoenix, Arizona. Police discovered that since getting his hands on Miller's money, Dozier had been spending it on lavish things and living a luxurious life. He lied to his friends, claiming his newfound wealth came from casino winnings. Subsequent investigations connected Dozier to the murder of Jason Griffin Green, which happened in July 2001. Green's already decomposing body was found in a desert on the north side of Phoenix. An altercation between the two men likely led Green to threaten to expose Dozier's meth production operation. To ensure no one could get in his way, Dozier shot Green in his trailer and disposed of his body. Green's murder would have gone undiscovered if it weren't for one of Dozier's former associates, Doug Powell. Powell informed the police about Green's murder and confessed how he and another man worked with Dozier to dispose of Green's remains. During the trial for Green's murder, Dozier claimed he didn't kill Green. Instead, he claimed he went out and returned to the trailer to find Green's dead body. Dozier stated he chose to hide Green's body and not inform the authorities, because doing so might expose his involvement in meth production. Powell further implicated Dozier by telling the authorities that Dozier had spoken to him about the murder of Miller. Dozier had told Powell he made a mistake by forgetting to remove a tattoo on Miller's back. The tattoo helped the police link the chopped-up body to a missing persons report before confirming it belonged to Miller. Dozier's argument during the trial for Miller's murder was that there was no proper evidence to prove he actually murdered Miller. Fortunately, the prosecution could prove their case by finding several witnesses to testify against him. Dozier was then sentenced to death for first-degree murder in 2007. As is usual with death row inmates, Dozier started appealing his sentence. But along the way, he made a drastic decision. In 2016, Dozier waived his right to future appeals, saying he was prepared to die. At that point, all he wanted was for the government to get it done and over with. Dozier's execution was first delayed in 2007 when a judge objected to the use of a particular drug for his execution because, when mixed with other drugs, it could cause the prisoners to feel themselves suffocating before dying. Dozier made efforts for his execution to be expedited, but his efforts kept going to waste. He began to grow agitated and started making comments about taking matters into his own hands and ending his life if the state continued to delay his execution. According to his lawyers, the longer he stayed in jail, the more his mental health deteriorated. His repeated desire to die quickly led the state to put him on suicide watch for months. On January 5, 2019, Dozier beat the suicide watch team and took his life in his cell at Ely State Prison in Ely, Nevada. 2 prison officials found him hanging from his bedsheet, which was tied to an air vent in the cell. The 48-year-old Scott Dozier had had enough of life on death row and ended his own life. Dozier committed suicide 6 months after his execution was delayed a second time. He was determined to die as soon as possible, but the delays kept coming, which meant he had to spend more years on death row. While it seemed like he really wanted to die, Dozier was just tired of being on death row and waiting to die. Before his death, Dozier granted a series of interviews where he talked about life on death. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. This is the face of a condemned man, staring down the barrel of his own mortality. A face that holds the power to both haunt and captivate, a window into the darkest corners of the human experience. At just 19 years old, he found himself on death row, his fate sealed by a crime that would haunt him until his final fleeting moments. And now, as the clock ticks down on his last day, the weight of his past decisions is etched into every line, every shadow that crosses his features. In those eyes, you can see the glimmer of a young man, once full of promise, now resigned to an ending he never imagined. The set of his jaw, the tension in his brow, they speak of an internal battle, a desperate struggle to come to terms with the reality that he will soon be no more. But his story is just one out of the last 24 hours of death row inmates. What do you think about these awkward moments in the lives of these guys? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Kevin Johnson. As the sun set on November 29, 2002, the state prison in Missouri was quiet, watching over the last hours of Kevin Johnson. Kevin was 37 years old and had been on death row for 17 years. He was now facing death by lethal injection. But Kevin did something surprising. He refused his last meal. It wasn't just about the food. It was his way of showing that he still had some control over his life, which had been taken from him bit by bit. This act made people outside the prison pay attention and feel even more sympathy for him. Inside the prison, Reverend Gray stayed with Kevin, offering comfort with Bible verses and prayers. Kevin apologized to the family of his victim and to his own family, showing he was ready to face his end. He hoped to meet his younger brother again, who had died years ago. Kevin chose not to say any final words, letting his silence speak for him. It was his last act of defiance. Kevin's 19-year-old daughter, Corey, desperately wanted to be with her father during his final moments. But a cruel state law stopped anyone under 21 from witnessing an execution. This added even more heartbreak to an already sad situation. Kevin's case had been full of controversy and legal battles. Many people believed racial bias played a big role. Prosecutor Robert McCulloch was accused of treating Kevin, a black man, much more harshly than he did a white man in a similar case. Special Prosecutor Edward Keenan investigated and found signs of discrimination. He discovered that McCulloch's team had purposely excluded black jurors in Kevin's second trial, which ended with the death sentence. Even with these findings, St. Louis Circuit Judge Mary Elizabeth Ott denied the motion to cancel Kevin's death sentence. She said there wasn't enough time to review the new evidence before the execution date. Many saw this as a failure of the justice system to address racial inequality. Both the Missouri Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to delay the execution. Missouri Governor Mike Parson also refused to grant clemency, sealing Kevin's fate. On November 29, 2022, Kevin Johnson was executed by lethal injection. The process started at 7:29 p.m., and he was pronounced dead at 7:40 p.m. His story ended in sadness and silence, marked by controversy and his final act of defiance among the last 24 hours of death row inmates. Robert Frada. Robert Frada's last day was meticulously planned, each moment leading to his inevitable end on that very January 9, 2023. As the day began, guards watched his every move. Despite being granted a last meal, Robert's choice was simple: pepperoni pizza, a garden salad with ranch dressing, and a banana milkshake. This plain meal reflected his state of mind. It offered no real comfort, just a final taste of the world he was leaving behind. Later, Robert met with his spiritual advisor. They talked deeply about faith and the afterlife. The advisor offered words of comfort and prayers, hoping to bring some peace to Robert's troubled soul. Robert's journey to this dark end began with the collapse of his marriage. He and his wife, Farah, were locked in a bitter divorce, filled with accusations and a fierce battle over their children. Robert couldn't accept Farah leaving him, and this led to a tragic decision. On the evening of November 9th, 1994, Farah returned home from a visit to the hair salon. As she opened the garage door, she was met by a man with a gun. 2 shots rang out. One echoed through the neighborhood, and the other silenced Farah forever. She lay in a pool of blood on the cold cement floor of her garage. The investigation into Farah's murder revealed a web of deceit. Detectives found that Robert had been asking people to kill his wife, offering money and even a Jeep as payment. His address book had the contacts of those he approached, and an envelope with $1,000 in his car suggested payment for the crime. The breakthrough came when Mary Gipp, the girlfriend of Joseph Pristash, testified before a grand jury. She revealed that Robert had first hired Pristash to attack Farah with a taser, an incident Farah had reported to the police. Later, Pristash recruited Howard Guidry to carry out the murder. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury found Robert guilty of capital murder. His sentence was death by lethal injection. At 6:00 p.m. on January 9, 2023, the execution began. The lethal injection was a cold, clinical process designed to end life swiftly. The chemicals flowed through Robert's veins, and within minutes, his life ended. He was pronounced dead at 7:49 p.m. Joseph Mitchell Parsons. Tragedy befell poor Joseph Mitchell Parsons, a man whose life was a tapestry of sorrow and despair. As the clock ticked down on his final day on Earth, Parsons, a man condemned to the ultimate sentence, entered the annals of criminal history. Those last 24 hours on death row were a somber reflection, fleeting connections, and the stark reality of a life about to be extinguished. Parsons, a resident of death row for over a decade, was to become the first person to be executed in Utah's new death chamber. His final day was a scripted routine, each hour a step closer to his ultimate fate. In the death watch cell, where the condemned are kept under close observation, Parsons engaged in activities that seemed to defy the gravity of his situation. He played cards, delved into games of chess, and conversed with his brother and cousin, who had come to be with him during these precious final hours. These simple pastimes were interspersed with moments of quietude, as Parsons grappled with the reality of his impending demise. They shared his last meal of Burger King, a final indulgence in the familiar comforts of life. Parsons' attorney believed his client chose this meal as a reflection of him taking control of his life, a desperate attempt to hold on to a semblance of autonomy. One of the most poignant moments was a brief 2-minute phone call with his sister, a final connection to the world he was about to leave behind. Parsons spun a narrative of self-defense, claiming that the victim had made a sexual advance, prompting the fatal altercation. But this claim did little to sway the course of justice. As the day waned and the hour of execution drew near, Parsons was escorted to the lethal injection room, where he was strapped to the gurney, IVs prepared, and the mechanisms of the death penalty set into motion. It was a clinical procedure carried out with precision, yet it marked the end of a human life, a life irrevocably marred by violence and loss. The road to his ultimate demise had begun when Parsons, a fugitive on parole, found himself hitchhiking across the scorching expanse of the California desert. It was here that fate would intertwine his path with that of Richard Lynn Nest, a 30-year-old man who had penned poignant notes to his 9-year-old son and wife before departing Loma Linda, California. Within 12 hours of their fateful meeting, Nest would be found stabbed to death, his body discarded callously at a rest stop near Para, Iron County. The brutality of the crime was stark, with 9 stab wounds to the face and chest, a silent testament to the violence that had occurred. At 10 minutes past 12 p.m. on October 15, 1999, Parsons' life was forever tainted by this act of cruelty. And now, at 12:18 a.m. on that final day, a physician checked Parsons' stopped heartbeat with a stethoscope, pronouncing him dead, the ultimate price paid for the violence that had consumed his life. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.